Hello, a very warm welcome to our live chat today, where we're going to be talking about podcasting for your education business. My name's Laura Wilkes, and I'm joined with my lovely guest today, Andrew Woodbury. We're going to be sharing our own journeys into podcasting, when podcasting is a good idea for education businesses, and we're going to talk about some common pitfalls to avoid and what to do instead to set you up for success. Andrew, it's lovely to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. This is fantastic.
It is super. I would say for people that are watching us live, we are going to be watching the chat today and we're going to be answering your questions. So please comment along as we're chatting. And if you do have a podcast or podcast idea, we'd love to hear that. So drop that in the chat because we'll love to, interact with you as we're chatting today. So Andrew, could you maybe start by sharing a bit about your journey, like your podcast, and how you got started?
Oh gosh, sure. Yeah, preparing for our chat today, I was able to kind of remember and reflect on like, oh yeah, when did it start? I first sat in front of a microphone in 2010. So almost like 14 years ago, and a friend of mine had his own podcast, an indie music podcast actually, and we became friends. And he was like, "Hey, you want to like come on the show and like, be a co-host for the day or whatever?" And I was like super nervous, and that was like my first exposure into that. And then just kind of kept doing that with him for a while. And was like, oh, this is kind of fun. This is interesting. And I didn't even know what a podcast was at that time. I'll be honest. Like I was like, what is it? And then yeah, with our company, with Learn Your English, we started our podcast. When we started the company, we knew we wanted to have a podcast, and we started ours, Teacher Talking Time. We just had our 5th year anniversary, I think it is, a few months ago. So it's been 5 years and of doing that, and that's been really fun. And it's a labor of love, we always say, because it's a lot easier to listen to a podcast than to produce one. I always joke, which is true, but we love doing it. And yeah, that's kind of been my 14 years of talking into a microphone in different respects, and it's just fun. I love it.
It's crazy how 14 years have gone by. I don't know about you. When I think about my podcasting journey, I've not been doing it for 14 years, been doing it for 6, but it's gone by really quickly. And it's amazing to see there's so much enthusiasm and interest now for podcasting. I'm so grateful that I started when I did. And do you feel the same, having started much, much earlier, 14 years ago?
I think so. I think so. I mean, it definitely learn a lot about it, and just getting more experience with it. It's fun, and yeah, I think for my personality, like I'm always, it's good to be ahead of, I don't know, ahead of the curve is the right word, but just like, with podcasting, I remember the learning curve, and it was steep, and there were so many things to get. So even at the very beginning, like 14 years ago, I wasn't doing anything. I would just show up at my friend's house. He had all the equipment. He did the producing. He had everything. Now he runs his own podcast production company called Podfly. It's like a big thing. They do corporate podcasts. Like he knows everything. So I just showed up and I was like, oh, let's have a beer and talk, and that was it. Versus when we started our own show, then having to like learn how to do that. So I'm grateful now having
Mhm.
started then, but I remember the learning curve being steep. So I do wonder, like, because for me, like the learning curve was very high. So definitely grateful for having get that out of the way, so that we can just enjoy doing the recordings and doing the show.
You know, it was the same for me when I listened back to my first season, which I'm really grateful that I actually have there. And I listen back, I'm like, oh, you notice the learning curve, right? You go on in terms of like the integrity of questions, the sound quality, the structure of the conversations.
Yes.
It is a bit awkward, I must say. I do listen back, I'm like, oh gosh, that's a bit of a jump cut. But I'm grateful that it's there because it kind of serves as a really timely reminder of just how much I've progressed. And it's so
Oh, our
much
first episode was terrible. Like I remember, like it's still there. Like it's in the channel, right? It's in the feed,
Yeah.
and you can see your stats, right? So I don't know. We don't do seasons per se, like I know you do. Um, but I don't know that if your show is like season, as if it was like a television series where it's like sequential, right? Maybe perhaps not. But in our stats, we can see that the most listened to episode is the first one. So I don't know if people, when a new subscriber like goes back to the beginning, and like if you're listening and you want to, please don't do that. Please, the first episode is the worst one. It's really, I can't listen to it. It's so bad.
But it's good to keep it there, isn't it? Just as that reminder. Maybe there's a
Yeah,
way to pin in a suggested episode, I think, on some platforms for people to start on. But
yeah,
yeah, I see that as well in my stats. I'm like, really? People are still listening to the first. Wow, okay. It's
yeah.
incredible to see. Brilliant. So thinking about
like watching Mad Men or something, I promise, you won't miss
Yeah.
any.
Multitask. You know, with teacher talking time now and how it's connected to learn your English, could you share a bit about like how your podcast works in terms of like, is there a bit of a interaction between your business goals and how the podcast supports that? I wonder if it's similar to mine or a bit different.
Yeah, for sure. So I think our as a business learning, we kind of we try to marry the two aspects that we really like, right? So entrepreneurship and the academic side of how people learn languages, how languages are learned. The initial conception, and this is the great thing about growing a business, right? Is you adapt and you kind of iterate over time. So certainly when we first started the podcast and the business, that the entrepreneurship part wasn't necessarily there. So we've kind of adapted to that. But we really wanted to start a podcast that literally kind of bridges the gap between the research world of our industry of what research is going on in SLA and on how people learn languages and what's happening in the classroom. And we wanted that to be a bridge where researchers could actually talk to practicing teachers and vice versa,
Mhm.
where oftentimes that doesn't happen. And so then we take that concept and we help teachers to design their own courses using those research concepts to make sure that when they are selling their courses and running their businesses, that it is from an evidence supported background. So I think, yeah, we marry those two concepts, I hope, quite well, where the podcast is speaking with someone who's doing the research, and then a teacher can use that in their own practice or to build a course for their business that uses those concepts.
And do you use your podcast as a space to promote like the services and products you offer as well? Are there points where you kind of remind folk about that? Because obviously you have your
Yeah,
at the core of it is the conversation with the researcher. How do you kind of make listeners aware that you also do other things outside of the podcast?
for sure. Great question. People ask this a lot, right? Where I think a common question is, how do I monetize my podcast? How
Yeah.
do I sell adverts, or how do I make money from doing a podcast? And the kind of I don't know if you agree with me, but my answer always is kind of like a negative one. It's like, well, you don't. You don't, because I mean there are obviously very, very huge podcasts in the world that make money, but that's not likely going to be your case. And it's not my
Mhm.
case. And I don't know, that's probably not your case either. But I think what you can do is you can monetize your own podcast with your own products,
Yes.
right? With the things that you sell yourself. So we do that. We have ads in our podcast, but they're just ours. They're our own ads.
Mhm.
So we have like a commercial break or at the beginning or wherever you would place, you know, um, a pre-roll, mid-roll at the end, right? Where you just talk about your own thing and say, hey, we're going to take a break. And by the way, while we're here, let's talk about this. And so we just kind of promote our own things as if we're selling ad spots in our own show for our own
Mm.
products.
That's exactly the same for mine. So I have considered other options because there's obviously many ways to monetize, isn't there? Like you can get sponsors, you can do affiliate links. And I do experiment with things because obviously I teach podcasting and I help educational institutions start podcasting. So I like to dabble to just to explore what works. But for me, the biggest way my podcast supports my business is that it serves as my brand, it's my portfolio, and I can use it to sell high ticket courses, which is the main kind of service I offer, training
Right.
teachers to do it for themselves, really, or offering services, full services for institutions. And that's, I mean, that brings in a lot more money than any sponsorship could, unless I was a massive podcast, like you say, like really high yielding, high download rates. Then sponsorship can bring in quite a bit of money in terms of like the proportion of downloads you're getting and the rate per that the sponsor's paying for those downloads. But if I'm talking about like what actually pays the bills, it's letting people know that I have this business, the services I offer, and letting them know when enrollment is. And that's, I mean, that's
Yeah.
my audience. I have an audience because I have a podcast. Yeah.
That's a more reasonable goal, I think, in my opinion. Like, and even I find it kind of interesting. Like a lot of when you listen to a podcast and there's a lot of ads, it does turn people off. But, like, it doesn't turn, because I understand it, like, well, if you wanna keep listening to this show for free, like, that's how they do it, that's how it's free.
Yeah.
So, there are ads. But even that, even in the if you think of the biggest podcasters and they have the audience, like, even ads is up and down, like, they go through seasons, right? The
Mhm.
companies that have the budget to do that, those businesses go up and down too, right? So, even if you have a big audience, it's not a guarantee that we're seeing that kind of that recession word now with big advertising companies not having the budget to pursue that. So I think pushing your own products is a great way. And in marketing, it's always difficult to know exactly where people are coming from if they buy your product. But for us, like, not always, but consistently we see when we have a survey form where people book a call with us, or we just ask them when we talk to them, like, "Hi, how did you find out about our work? How did you discover us?" More often than you would think, that, "Oh, your podcast. I listen to your podcast." Like it's pretty consistent.
I'm so glad you said that, because I literally had a conversation with a client who's potentially considering my services and signing up for the podcast Pathfinder. And I asked her, like, how did you hear about this? She's like, oh, I listened to your podcast. And I feel like I already know you because of the podcast. I'm like, ah, brilliant.
Mhm.
That's exactly what I want to achieve. And it means that I'm attracting people that get what I do and get me and feel in alignment with that. So it already feels like there's some familiarity, and we're starting on kind of common ground rather than having to start from scratch when building that relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's what a podcast can be. It's a very it seems like a one-way conversation, but it's really intimate when you're the listener, right?
Hmm.
I mean, we make podcasts, but we also, I hope, I listen to podcasts. I know you do too. And if you make a podcast, I hope you listen. So when you're listening, you understand that kind of it's the perception of a two-way conversation, right? And it's a very interesting. I had someone the other day. We were on a call, and she's like, "Oh, I feel like same thing. I feel like I know you. I've heard your voice all the time." And it's always like a little bit uncomfortable. It's like, okay, yeah, sure, but at the same time, it's like a really nice compliment
Yeah.
and things like that. So it is a good way to. I say this, like, when people ask. I'm sure you get this question a lot. Like, is a podcast a good way to, like, build my audience, to, like, get some, because social media is so difficult and all this kind of stuff, or in conjunction with that. And I kind of say no. I always say a podcast is not a great way to grow a new audience because of that element, right? But it's a great way to nurture an existing audience, to
Mm,
develop a deeper relationship with people who already know you exist at a base level, right? Where, when's the last time you just randomly scrolled through Spotify and started listening to a podcast that you've never heard of? Like, probably never,
mm,
right?
mhm.
We base our podcast interests on recommendations from friends, on things that we see, on things that we're already listening to. So podcasts are a great way, I think, to develop a deeper relationship with people who already know who you are.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we're moving into like a space now where if people don't have a podcast, like you often look for them. If I'm going to a business or I'm wanting to think about purchasing with a business,
Mm,
I firstly see, do they have a podcast, have a YouTube channel? How can I interact with them in some way? I think it is quite difficult to start from scratch. And that's why with new podcasters I train, I get them to go on other people's podcasts. Because there's a engaged audience.
yeah.
That's a way you can obviously start growing your audience, and also think about repurposing the content to go onto social media so they're not creating multiple content, and being that hamster wheel, which I'm not a fan of just creating lots of content for different things. But
No.
I think we're already kind of segueing into this, aren't we, Andrew? Like talking about, when is podcasting a good idea for educators in business? I think that you've already started to kind of move into this area. Could we explore this a bit more? Because I think there's folk listening that are like, oh, should I start a podcast? Or maybe I shouldn't now.
Yeah. There's no right or wrong answer to this, of course. I think, well, one would be, I think, from just the work that's involved side of it. Like, I think you want to be committed to doing this for the right reasons. So I think there are a lot of reasons that podcasts really work. If you have a business, a teaching business, right? So, brand awareness, nurturing people who already know you, developing that kind of relationship, helping people to learn something, all the marketing stuff that people teach about website this, lead magnet this, free community this. The purpose is to get people to know you and to help them along their journey a little bit before, and then they're more likely to commit to working with you in a paid program, for example. And podcasts, I think, would be exactly the same kind of thing. So if you can conceptualize your show, if it's for learners, for example, that helps them in their journey a little bit to move forward, and then they're going to be more likely to join you on whatever you're selling, then that's probably a good idea. But the rule of seven, I don't know if you're familiar with, I think I made this up maybe, but I don't think I made it up. The rule of seven, where the majority of new podcasts stop making a show before episode seven, because it's so hard.
Mm,
Because it's like kind of a passion project at the beginning, and it seems fun and like, oh yeah, this is going to be great. And then by episode 3 and 4, it's like, oh, this is a lot. This is a lot of work. And then most stop by episode 7. So I would say, from a mindset perspective, commit to a year
mhm.
to do a show, which means then, in conjunction, commit to a consistency. Don't say I'm going to have a show, a weekly show. Like, no, you're not. Like, that's not
That's
going to
really
happen,
intense. Yeah.
right? So we used to do twice a month, and that was too much. So now we do once a month, and they're long form, but it's once a month, and that we invite the guest and we arrange the time, and there's research on the guest, so there's a bit involved. So we do once a month, and that's perfectly fine for us. But I would say commit to a year, because then you're actually saying I'm doing this, and that will help you kind of like conceptualize, is this something that I want to do? But I think it can be a really great way, to show your audience and show people what you can do in that niche that you work in, especially
Yeah.
with language. I mean, with learners listening skills and then having them do something after they listen, like it just seems like a natural fit for that as well.
I really like the idea that you just mentioned like setting a goal of like committing to a certain period of time. I normally ask new podcasters to commit to a number of episodes, just to kind of to experience it and to learn from it. And regardless of what happens after that period of time, they've got something that can potentially stand alone. And then they can make a really informed decision of like, okay, how do I want to proceed with this? Do I want to continue podcasting?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the learning curve at the beginning, right? So like I had that learning curve, but like making it, I'm sure you do this with your clients, like making it as simple as possible for yourself. I have a
Yeah.
personality with tech where like go into a rabbit hole of like I want to learn everything. And I don't think that's a bad thing, but it really distracts me from actually doing it. So just like having a simple setup, don't think too much about it. And these days, even though we started Teacher Talking Time in 2018, it hasn't been that long, but there's so many more tools, just like what we're doing now with Restream, that just make it so user friendly to do digital recording, that make it really friendly. So I think there's a lot of, don't spend too much time on like thinking of what this, what that. Think of what the show is going to be about. I think for me, that's where I would say you have to start, because the microphone doesn't matter if it's boring. The type of webcam you have doesn't matter if people don't learn anything, right? And Leo and I went to a podcast conference, summit, meetup, I guess, here in Toronto a few months ago. And some of the takeaways were the people were speaking about, like, you have to, even though the podcasts are free, there's so much competition for attention. You're competing for someone's
Mm-hmm.
attention,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what is it going to be about your show that people are going to choose their limited amount of time before work, after work, on their lunch break to listen to your voice, to your show, and not somebody else's?
Yeah, I think you have to kind of be quite intentional about who you're going to serve, right? And not try and please too many people, but really know who your listener is, and not just demographics, not just the basic stuff, but like really, what is it that gives them value by listening to you? That exactly what you just said there. Like, are you helping them move up in their career or to achieve yeah, more opportunities, or are you going to help them develop their language so they can travel more or build relationships within their existing community? Like, what is it that you're helping them achieve by spending some time with you and hanging out?
Exactly. And thinking about how most, not most, but many people have their own podcast, right? So what's going to be different? And this word hire comes up usually when we talk about money being exchanged. But people hire podcasts. This is what this one of the guys said at the summit, where he just said, listeners, your listeners hire you to solve a problem on the podcast,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they're listening. So they're, I always say things are expensive in two ways, either with money or with your time, right? Either way, you're paying, right? So they're investing their time to listen to you and your show. What are they getting in return? What are they hiring you for? Even though the podcast is technically monetarily free. So what do they get after those 20 minutes or 30 minutes? What problem is being solved? How are they better? How are they moving forward? And if you have a language or thinking about having a language learning podcast, really think about that, because there's a million podcasts that help people with English, right? So
Yeah.
what would be the differentiator? Why would they choose yours and not the other ones?
Exactly. What's the differentiating factor? What's special? And again, being really intentional about who your listeners are. When I started podcasting, because my podcast is aimed at TEFL or TESOL teachers, whichever term you want to use. I tried to aim it at every single TESOL teacher. I tried to please everybody, and you can guess what happened. I didn't please anybody because it was just great. The
Right.
grading was all over the place. Like, was I talking to a teacher at the start of their career or somebody who was quite a seasoned teacher who was looking for inspiration and ideas, like in a staff room setting? And the way I found out is just by simply asking. Like, I put some things out there. I did the first season. It sounds so obvious, doesn't it? And then I just asked people like who were listening, like, why are you listening? Who are you? What are you getting from this? And the resounding answers were like, we're all experienced teachers, 5+ years. And the reason why we're listening is that it's 15 minutes. We don't have a lot of time. And we like the fact it's super practical and bite-sized. And I was like, oh, yeah, why was I trying to please everybody when my listeners who are showing up are the ones I should really lean into? But yeah, it was such an obvious thing, but I didn't think to do it sooner. Yeah. Things you learn the hard way, hey?
It's well, us too, honestly. Like we started our show, I gave that nice little buttoned up pitch at the beginning, but like that's not how we started. Like it was more general, right? It was, oh, we'll have discussions about English language teaching and approaches and ideas for activities, and it was all over the place. It wasn't central, right? But when we kind of, I think, pretty quickly started, we knew we wanted to be an interview-based podcast, but we didn't start interviewing researchers, I don't think, until a little bit later. And once we started doing that, we definitely noticed a shift, and that aligned with what we were interested in. And then clearly there was an audience for that as well, so that became the focus. And then we figured that out and we ran with that. But asking the audience is, you laugh like it's so simple, but like no, like it's not obvious when you're in that moment, though. For me, for sure, like you always need to ask people, but like it's not always the first thought of like, oh, I'll just ask them. Like it's usually not the first consideration.
Yeah, it's just something I completely steamrolled over when I first started. And on reflection, had I, you know, I would do things differently. I'd talk to prospectives, ideal listeners I had in my mind before I started creating, and think about those regular touch points in getting that regular feedback, because that's what will help to develop the content, the structure, the style, right? Yeah.
If you are listening and you have a show already, one of the at the summit that I went to with Leo, he mentioned sending out a survey to your audience, so just like you've kind of mentioned, and just kind
Yeah.
of getting information on it. And two questions stuck out to me that he recommended asking. One of them was this: think about a friend or family member who would like this show. Tell me about them, and describe the show for that person.
Oh, that's lovely.
That was a really nice one. And then the second one was, if this show were to die tomorrow, never be produced again, what one thing, if any, would you miss?
Oh, that's really powerful questions.
Yeah.
How would you answer that if for your own perspective as a podcaster?
Oh, that's a great
Oh yeah,
question.
I just flipped it. Sorry.
Oh my God. About my own show? I'm a bit biased, I guess. I can answer it from the production side because I don't think I can answer from a listener's perspective because I'm too biased. I'm just like, oh, this is great. This is awesome. Like some of them are not. Like, let's be objective, right? Um, I would really miss my favorite part about doing the show is actually like just talking to the guests that we have. And they're like really, really interesting people. And we learn so much about language and about teaching and about research just by talking with them. And it's after every one, we just get together the three of us afterwards, like, oh my God, that was amazing. That was so cool. And talking to like really interesting people. So I would just miss that because it's great. We've always joked like even if we stop doing our business one day, let's just keep doing this because it's so
Yeah.
much fun. Yeah.
I think that's a big part of my experience as well, is like those interactions and those meets that you have with guests that you wouldn't normally have if you didn't have the purpose of the podcast to kind of act as that space. And added to that, when I hear back from my listeners and they say why they listen, it's just like, oh wow, there's somebody in like Brazil. I've never been to Brazil, like who's listening to this while they're doing their commute to work. And I think that's really incredible to see how far it can travel and how it can really help people.
Yeah. It's shocking. It's humbling, honestly.
Yeah.
Like when you see all these stats of countries and things that people are listening and all the, vanity metrics, but like downloads and whatever. And it's like, my gosh, I never, not that that's the purpose, but like it's interesting. It's actually crazy.
Yeah, it enables us to have impact beyond our own like walls of our own community, like the physical limitations of the own community, which I think is really cool. Vanity metrics, yeah, for sure. But it's so
Well, there's a
cool.
whole thing about downloads, right? Like it's
Mhm.
like a thing that is you mentioned is used to if you're going to sell actual ads, it's used, but like downloads could mean if you have 1,000 downloads on a show, it could be like the same person listening 1,000 times in theory, right? It doesn't mean
Mm.
it's unique listens. So it is kind of an interesting way to gauge, but in a more broader organic sense, like yeah, it's a really cool thing when people around the world kind of can listen and that's how it works. But if you even if you think about smaller listening, like if you had 50 people listen to your show, and that might not sound like a lot, but like imagine giving a talk. Like ITEFL's coming
Mm.
up, right? I know you're going. Like imagine being in a room and there's 50 people sitting in front of you listening to you talk. Like imagine that. Like that's a lot of people, right? So like just because we have these numbers of vanity metrics of podcasts, like thousands and thousands of people, whatever. Like, no, no, no. Imagine you're in a room with them and you're talking to them. How would you feel then? I think that's a for me a better way of thinking about it.
I think that's a really good reminder because when we start out, or if you're a new podcaster, it can be a bit how can I say disheartening when you're not getting like thousands of downloads. And there's obviously a lot of literature out there that talks about other big podcasters who are getting significant download rates. And when you only see like 30, 20, 50, listens, downloads, it can be a bit like, oh, well, should I continue? But like you say, if you put that into real life, that's an audience that shows up to listen to you every month or every 2 weeks, or every week, however frequently you create, who want to hear from you, who are already warm. That's really significant. I try and actually visualize them standing outside, which is really terrifying when you think about the numbers. 50 people stood outside that's 50 people who are potentially keen to hear about your next course, your next book, maybe your next workshop that you're doing. They're happy to hear about it, and that's really
Yep,
powerful.
it is. It really is. It's wild. I mean, podcasts are one way to do this, but it's really just building that community, right? So if you
Yeah.
want to start a show or you have a show, really think about that because there are people that will be interested, and the reach is global, of course. But be patient, right? I think for us, it took 2 years of doing the show consistently for us to really see an uptick
Hmm.
in traction, however you want to define that. I'm sure that's probably a general rule of thumb for a lot of people who don't have like big marketing muscle behind a show. For the organic building of it, like 2 years of consistently, I think it's just consistency, right? So putting out shows consistently and just putting in the work and in sales, we talk about like detaching yourself from the sale, just being curious about what the person needs, what they're looking to do, and seeing if there's like a natural fit. And if so, pursuing that. And if not, that's okay too. I think with podcasting, it's the same. Like, don't like detach yourself from the download, I guess would be the parable, the analogy there, right? Just making sure that you like, that you're proud of, that you think serves the audience and what they need and it's an ultimate delayed gratification endeavor, but if you do it consistently, then you'll see from that perspective a result that you'll probably be happy with.
Yeah. And I think for consistency, when you talk about consistency, you talked about earlier, like the sustainability. And maybe going every week is a bit too ambitious, but if that means like consistency, if that means every month for you, then that's where you start. I made the mistake of trying to scale a bit too quickly in T-Cell Pop. So I attempted to go
Okay.
weekly a few years ago before I was ready to. And it was just I started like really not enjoying the podcasting process because it was too much work for what I could take at the time. So we went back to every other week. And it isn't until like a few months ago, about 6 months ago now, we went to weekly because we could. Um, yeah.
Walk if you can, walk us through that mistake then. Why was what specifically happened at the first iteration that made weekly too much?
Well, I was working full time as
Okay.
well as doing the podcast. And while it was working quite well with every other week, that was fine. When we went to weekly, it meant that I had no weekends free. So you can imagine what that would due to like time and energy levels and just the quick way to burnout that was paving for me. And it just took out the fun because when you're not having time to rest from whether it's a passion project, which it was at the time, and also work, it made it feel like, oh, just a little bit of a grind. And there tends to be like a hustle or grind culture that's quite um, promoted in some ways.
Hmm.
Yeah, but having tried it, I just realized it was taking out the fun. And if I wanted to continue podcasting, I had to go back to doing it every other week. Else otherwise I was going to quit completely. That was how I felt.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yep. No, I relate to that. I hear you. It's hard. Like again, it's like easy to go on your app and like, oh, I'll click play and listen. But on the other side, when you're making the show, like there's a lot more involved, right?
Yeah, there
I
is.
think, yeah, consistency is the biggest word for me, though, you can, and I think you do this with we do this with ours. Like you can batch record. Like just because you want to release one a month doesn't mean you have to record one every month. You can record two or three in a week and then like bank them, right? So create a system for yourself that
Yeah.
would work. Like we've basically recorded the entire year's worth already, and we're just releasing them, as we go through. We've probably good until September or October. I think we have 2 more to go.
Oh, that's brilliant.
But
Yeah.
basically, yeah, like we're done. And we're just like putting it together. So it's intense in, the first quarter of the year. And then in the last quarter of this year, we're gonna batch record for the first half of next year, right? So when you have a system in place, that would be my advice, I think. It's not obviously there's two parts. One is how frequently do you want to release,
Hmm.
but that doesn't necessarily correlate exactly to how you would record them. So you can have two systems for that. And then if you can stick to it more or less, then I think that's a recipe for success.
Absolutely. Workflows are the key thing that will help you scale as well. Like I think you just mentioned there, like thinking about how you record when you're recording and doing batch recordings. That is a key thing. That's definitely been the case for when we made the move to video podcasting. Video takes a lot more editing, it takes a lot more time. But we
Mm,
refined the workflow, got really intentional about that very, very early on. It enabled it to
no
be
kidding.
sustainable.
We used to put our videos on or our podcasts on YouTube, but then just very honest, like I hate video editing, and I just was like, no, not doing it anymore. And we just went back to the back to the audio because it takes so much more time. Like it's
It does.
insane.
It really does. But that's, kudos to you for realizing like, this is just not working. Let's do a rollback to this because this does work. And this, at least you tried it, experimenting. You wouldn't know
Yeah.
if you didn't try.
But now it's coming back because I found a new tool that makes it easier. It's like an AI video editing tool called Descript, which is great. And
Yeah.
now we're back, and it makes it just super, super simple. And before that's kind of about me, but into the weeds. But there's this debate in podcasting communities. I want to get your opinion on it. What is a podcast? Is a video podcast a podcast?
Can be, yeah. I mean, it is now, isn't it? It comes in audio or video options, but it needs to be in digital format, of course, available on demand for people to access. And whether that's
Hmm.
on demand behind a sign-in wall, I think that's one thing that people often don't realize. There's a huge surge in private podcasts that people may have behind a login wall, or obviously we've got the public, what we see in the public sphere that people can access on demand anywhere on Spotify, Apple, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
But yeah, it needs to be accessible on demand for whether privately or publicly, depending on where it's based.
it's interesting, right? There's this company called Sounds Profitable, which is really interesting, and they do like market research and data analysis for podcast trends. And they have an article that's I'm just looking at my other screen here that says like podcasting's video dilemma, essentially, right? So more podcast listeners now say that they've watched a podcast in the last 30 days than listened to one.
Mm,
But simply popping your, you know, recording onto YouTube doesn't work. People won't watch it.
exactly, exactly.
So the question is, what are podcasters to do? How do you marry more people are watching the video version of a podcast, but you can't just put a video on. So what do
Mm,
people do? It's quite interesting. So Descript is, I think, a good tool for this because it allows you to edit with speaker view camera, and it just
mhm.
automatically goes back and forth. So you don't have to do that. So I'm really game with that, and it pulls social media clips for me. I don't have to do all of that stuff. So long story longer, we're back on video. So I'm
Yeah.
slowly, but it still is a little time consuming. So I haven't quite finished, but we're getting back to it.
And that's cool that you can actually take the clips. I think that's the one thing that we do video is not only video is great for showing things if there's an aspect of my guest that wants to really walk through something. So we did that with Joe Dale when he walked through certain tools that you can use for accessibility, which really worked well. And I obviously let the audio only listeners say, like, you need to hop over to YouTube to see this working to make sense. Um, but yeah, the other part is that you can use the clips, the repurposing. I mean, you can do audiograms as well. That's an option. But for me,
Yeah.
I've found the video short clips are brilliant. And that helps to direct traffic to the listeners, to the listens. Most of my podcast listeners are listening for the audio only because of, again, my profile. They're
Same.
busy teachers. They're doing other things while they're listening. So it works for that profile that I'm trying to target.
Yes, and video clips for social media work really well as
They really
well.
do.
We used to do audiograms as well, but the reach, like the metrics, are just crazy. If you just plop a 30-second video extract from it, it's it's way more engaging, and people comment and they like it more. So definitely video is the way to go, I think, for that kind of stuff for sure.
Mhm. I realise it's quite quiet in the comments, even though there are people watching us online today. So please do let us know what your questions are as we're chatting. So I am watching the comments for people that have joined us live. Like, if you have questions in regard to what Andrew's just been sharing about, like when podcasting works well and what to keep in mind, we're going to move on to talk about common pitfalls, which I know some of you are probably like, "Yep, we're ready for this now. Tell us the mistakes to avoid." As you're thinking about your podcasting journey. But please feel free to let us know what questions you have as we move along. Do you feel good to move on to talk about the pitfalls, the
I feel
common,
very good
common
about it.
things?
Yeah,
Yeah, where should we
absolutely.
start? There's quite a few that we actually thought of. We have to be quite niche and
Yeah.
talk about a few.
Well, a quick story, like when I was thinking about this chat today, it reminded me of that very first episode that I don't like of our show, and the reason I don't like it is because the first episode we recorded before that was awesome, in my opinion. It was great. So we sat down to do it in Leo's house, the three of us together in the room, and we did it, and it was amazing. We were like really passionate. We were like, "Oh my god, this is great!" And then at the end, we realized that the software didn't work. It didn't record anything
Oh no.
that we said,
Oh, that's
and we
the
had
worst.
nothing. And then we had to do it again, and then the second time you do it, like, it's not, it's not as
Mm,
good. Um, so I think keep your tech simple, right? So I think that can happen. I mean, these things are gonna happen, but keep your tech simple would be my first pitfall of just, like, don't overcomplicate it. Just have one way to record. Get a whatever microphone, not a Blue Yeti, just get a microphone. And I saw that post. And just go, and that would be the don't overthink it. I think overthinking it is the first pitfall, and just like anything else, like in the business or just in life, just get started with it. Our first episodes are not great, but I think the ones now are better because of the ones that aren't great, and we learned from it. So I think that's
mhm.
that's the first one.
People can be quite uncomfortable about putting something out there that they don't feel is that good, and being comfortable with that learning curve. It can almost be a bit embarrassing. Um, yeah, that can be usually what stops people. Because sometimes I work with folk, they've developed a really great podcast, it's ready to go, and then they're like, "Oh, but it's not good enough. I should really spend a bit more time editing it." And yet, it is. It is good. It should go out there.
I,
Do you have any tips on
that's
how to overcome that kind of, it's almost like a circuit breaker where people go to post and they're like, "Oh no, I'm not going to do it."
What other people think of you is none of your business.
Oh, yes, that's a good one.
Like, who cares? Like the people who are going to listen are going to listen, and the ones who aren't. That's kind of my philosophy about it. I think pitfall number two would be over editing. You don't need to do
Mhm.
that. Like, just you literally don't, like, could just put it as is. Like, that's option one. I know people are like, oh my god, no, you have to like take out, like, but you don't have to. They have to in what sense? Like, you don't have to do anything. If that makes it a way that you can get a show out that you like, that you want to be out there without stressing about it, then do it. That would be
Mhm.
my advice. At a very basic level, the one level up from that is, go on Epidemic Sound, download a little jingle music at the beginning, put it in there, and then put it at the end. And then you're done. Then you have a little nice, bookend to your show. And okay, go through, and anytime there's like a 2-second pause, just delete it. But otherwise, like, don't over edit. Just,
Mhm.
people don't care that much. People care more about the sound. So a good, and I think the secret to editing is you can't fix bad original audio, basically, right?
It's
So,
very time consuming too, and you often end up distorting the voice if you have to do a lot of work to it. Yeah.
right. So get a nice mic, don't stand 10 feet away from it. Get mic technique, sit right there and just do it. And if you don't like it, you can always re-record it, but I would really encourage you to, like, now, the first episode that I make fun of now, I'm joking, like, I don't like it. At the time, I liked it, right? So over time, you learn, like, oh, we're getting better, and you
Mhm.
can look back and say, like, oh, I didn't know what I didn't know, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think you can still just do it and put it out.
There's so much relatability in people following you on that journey as well. Whether it's like the improvement they see over episodes, it makes you so much more human. And also the part of like not over editing, like leaving in the hesitations, the false starts, and like, whoops, just spilt my coffee
Yeah,
there, that sort of thing. Like that, those human things. That's You talked about at the very start of this chat, like podcasting being such an intimate experience for the listener. And I think by keeping those things in, they'll feel like you're so much easier to reach out to. So when you talk about your offer, your courses and stuff, they'll be like, oh yeah, like I'll reach out to them because they're not trying to be perfect.
great point. Great point. If the overall purpose is to nurture that community that already kind of knows you and likes you, then by over editing and kind of making a, I don't want to say inauthentic, but just like a different version of yourself in
Yeah.
the show is like, well, why? Because the whole purpose is to like nurture the people that already like who you are. So like be you. Now, yeah, if you like have a bunch of curse words and that's not what you want to do, then take them out. But like otherwise, like I think people want to, with business, like with niching and whatever, like it's always, we always like, you don't want to have any gray area. You want someone to like listen and be like, oh, this show is definitely for me, or like, oh my god, why am I wasting my time? Like I'm out of here. Like perfect. Both of those things are absolutely perfect. There's a decisive decision that happened, right?
Hmm.
So be yourself and let the people that like you and gravitate towards you be able to be a part of it. So yeah, don't over edit.
That's good. That's really solid advice. What else have we got on our list? Because I realize we're quickly running out of time, but we've got
Rapid
a few more
fire.
points. Yeah.
So this one might be a bit harsh, but I think you'd be better for it in the long run if you're listening. Is a podcast that's just you and someone chatting about something is not gonna work.
What,
Okay.
what, when you say chatting, are we talking about podcasts where I hear podcasts that start like, "Hey, how are you? How are things going?" And there's like 5 minutes of that at the start, and then
It could be one example. Yeah,
yeah,
could be. I think just like cut to the chase. And it comes back to the concepts of the show, right? Like what's the aim? What's the objective? What is the jobs to be done of the listener? Are you familiar with this jobs to be done concept? Where
tell us
people
more about
hire buy a product to finish a job, right? So
that. Yeah,
really quick story if I can. Someone bought, I know we only have 3 minutes, but like why would someone, I watched this marketing webinar with Caitlin Bourgeois. I'm mispronouncing her name. She's great. She's fantastic. She's Canadian. And she told the story of she bought an old school alarm clock, like a standalone, like on your desk, like not a smartphone, like an alarm clock where you have to like, it has the bells and you have to like hit it to turn it off.
oh yeah, I can hear
Why do
the
you think
sound now.
why do you think she bought it?
Because it's not a distraction, whereas a smartphone, if you have that as your alarm, like I do, it tends to like suck you into work as well. And that
Exactly.
is just one purpose thing. Alarm clock. It just does what it says. That's all it is. Just to
Exactly.
tell the time and wake you up when you need it.
Exactly. And if that alarm clock company, the old school alarm clock company, was a podcast and they're trying to sell their listener on the features of this alarm clock, no one's going to buy it because
Mm,
they're not buying an alarm clock. They're buying an escape from using their smartphone before they go to sleep, because when you're on your screen, you can't fall asleep, you get tired. And what she really wanted to do was she wanted to wake up early and exercise. And
mm.
that was her problem. And her problem was she was staying up late on her phone, getting kind of amped up in her brain. Her brain was active. She couldn't fall asleep. And then she would hit the snooze 3 or 4 times in the morning and not work out.
I
So
feel
she
like this
wanted a
is my
way to stop using her smartphone at night so that she could exercise in the morning. And so
yeah.
therefore her solution to that was she bought an old school alarm clock. Now, if that old school alarm clock was a podcast and their marketing team said, hey, you want to exercise in the morning and stop using that at night, you should listen to this show. That's the jobs to be done. People would listen to that show. So really find out what jobs your listeners have to be done. And usually it's not obvious. A little bit of thought, ask them, but find that out. And don't just chat about anything. Solve that problem. Identify their jobs to
Mhm.
be done.
That's really powerful, Andrew. Like really thinking about the problem that your podcast solves. And it's funny when you were talking about that whole like snooze button stuff, I had to laugh because I'm like, oh yeah, maybe I should get an old school alarm clock. Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, brilliant. I think there's one more that we wanted to squeeze in. Do you think we can squeeze it in? Like one more pitfall to avoid?
It's your show. Let's do it.
Ah, yeah, let's how about repurposing, like creating content, creating a podcast and then not promoting it? That's like surely people will just come and listen to it, right? I put it out there, that's enough, right?
Yeah. If you're Kevin Costner, if you build it, they will come and Field of Dreams. Yes, but otherwise, not really, right? Yeah, repurposing. This is a big pitfall. You got to repurpose. And I'm guilty of not doing enough of this as well. I think everyone to an extent is, but yeah, like anything, if you create something, repurpose it, right? So leading up to our chat today, I was able to create 3 or 4 pieces of content online talking about it, a little bit of things that we might talk about, sharing it. A newsletter came of it. A little bit of a short video came of it. I'm sure next week you're going to be splicing this together and putting some things out about it in your newsletter. Repurpose everything, right? The only person who sees or reads all of your content is you. I promise. If you put something out there, 80% of people probably didn't see it. Or if you put it in your newsletter, half of the people didn't open it. Not because they didn't want to, but just because they were busy or whatever, right? So repurpose, repurpose, repurpose. What we do with our show is we have an episode and then we actually clip 3 shorter versions. Like our show is very long, right? So over an hour. And then for the YouTube, we clip like 5 to 7 minute extracts and we put them as separate clips. And we're able to have a video a week that goes up there. So we have the long form and then 3 shorter ones. And then for
Mhm.
social, we have, between 30 seconds and 3 or 4 30 to 60-second clips, easy for you to say, that go out onto social to promote it and all going to the same place of listening to the show. So yeah, definitely. And if you do blogs, you could, instead of a newsletter, you could do a blog. Instead of any of these things, you could, replace them with something else. But you want to repurpose the thing that you've done into different things because yeah, that decreases your workload, but also allows people to see your show in different ways and come to it for a different people come to your show for different reasons. So it allows them different opportunities to do that.
I think that's a really fantastic tip to stay on. And for folk who are listening and thinking about what content they can post on social media, that's where the podcast can be great long form content for you to recut and like distribute. I don't know about you, but I also use AI to help me with a few things. So if I've got the
Oh yeah.
transcript that's all automatically generated from my episode, you can put that into ChatGPT or Gemini, whichever software you prefer. And then I ask it to help me summarize key points. And then that helps me write my newsletter or summarize things into carousel posts. And I think considering how many platforms people may be balancing who are watching this, creating a hero content that you can then cut up to draw people to your show, but also help build your presence on other platforms that you feel are relevant, can be a real time saver.
Huge, huge. And what
Mm.
I do now, our show, we have a little bit of a benefit because there's 3 of us, and usually there's at least 2 of us when we record. So what I'm able to do in real time is I'm sitting here just like I am, and I have my laptop over here, and I'm making notes on 2 columns. One is things to edit. So if the Zoom freezes or like we say something weird. And the other one is what I call pull quotes. That's my second column, where they're going to use the highlights of things like, oh, that was really good. That was really interesting. And with the timestamp. So when I go
Hmm.
into edit, I don't have to find it. I know where it is and I can just pull it out really quickly. And those become the repurposing content.
That's a brilliant like tip for really refining your workflow so you can scale and do things without it taking too much time, like really efficiently.
Mhm.
Brilliant. It's been fab talking to you today, Andrew. The time has flown by. We've
No
talked about
kidding.
so much. We talked about our own experiences, like when is a good time to podcast for educators in business, and we've covered some really crucial pitfalls there. I'm really glad we were able to touch upon so many of those points. If you do have a question before we disappear, this is your last call to drop it into the comments so Andrew and I can answer. I mean, of course, if you're watching the replay, you can drop a question. We'll get back to you,
For
obviously,
sure.
afterwards. But as we close today's show, Andrew, how can people find out what you're doing and potentially about your services and courses that you offer?
Yeah, for sure. So first of all, the podcast is called Teacher Talking Time, and you can find that in any app wherever you find your podcasts. And we have a free community as well for where we help teachers get started on their business journey right at the beginning for free. So there's a QR code on the screen. It's called the Teacherpreneur Support Network, or TSN. And yeah, we work with teachers who are looking to supplement their income, want to kind of start a business, and just don't know where to start. So we give you some tips and tricks and some strategy to get started that way. And you can join by clicking or scanning that QR code on the screen there. And then we also have our teacher accelerator program for teachers a bit further along who, maybe already have a business, have some one-to-one clients, but don't have a niche and don't have a product. And there we really help teachers move away from selling time and creating a course to be we talk about the hero content of a podcast, so the hero product of your business. And we like to say that just because you can't teach one-to-one forever, that's kind of the idea. So helping them to productize the problem they solve is what we do inside the TAP program.
That's brilliant. Thanks for sharing that, Andrew. And we can maybe include the links as well in the comments as well if people are looking for that link for quick access. Thank you
Sure.
so much. It's been so lovely talking to you. I really appreciate your time. And I'm so glad we got to do this collaboration. I've been following your work and the podcast for a long
Oh,
time. So I really
likewise.
appreciate it. And I appreciate
Likewise.
how early it is for your side as well.
Oh,
So
I got my
thank
big cup of coffee, and it's
you.
all good. It's all good. Before we go, Laura, I know you have a thing called the podcast Pathfinder, and you have the word finder in the title. So how do people find it?
Oh, perfect. Actually, thank you for reminding me because the podcast Pathfinder is opening up for enrollment. You can join the next course cohort on the 8th of May. So if you're wanting help in planning, recording, editing, and publishing a podcast and redistributing it, just like Andrew was talking about earlier, then this course is for you. If you want to find out more, you can go to my website or just simply message me on the platform where you're watching this video.
Amazing. I
Thanks so much.
wish you existed 5 years ago,
Yeah.
because the hours I spent figuring out, MacGyvering what you teach there, I would have paid you whatever to do it in like a couple of weeks. I spent obsessed like months and months and months and like testing, and nothing worked. And like this, I can't just, oh my God, it was overwhelming. So if you're just starting and you want to like get set up, that's perfect. It's perfect.
Yeah, cuts down the time and the frustration for sure. Thanks everybody for watching. Thank you, Andrew. And if you have any other questions and you're watching this replay, drop them in the comments and we'll get back to you. All right, it's been lovely. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Andrew. See you soon.